If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Let's continue. New York City has always been a city of contrasts. Anyone who lives here learns that early on. On one side, you have the mirrored skyscrapers reflecting the grey sky, the chaotic traffic pulsing like clogged arteries, the frantic pace of people who live by the minute. On the other, you have the quiet, tree-lined neighborhoods where silence is expensive and privacy is a luxury few can afford. It was in one of these places, in the heart of the Upper East Side, that Edward Martin built his fortress. The house was imposing, 3 stories of glass, concrete, and marble, surrounded by an impeccable garden that looked more like a magazine photograph than a living space. Everything there was planned, meticulously thought out, coldly executed. Neutral colors dominated: white, gray, beige, nothing too vibrant, nothing to bother the eyes or awaken unwanted emotions. The furniture was Italian designer, contemporary art decorated the walls, and the travertine marble floors shone like a mirror under the strategically placed lighting. It was beautiful, no doubt, but it was cold, freezing. Actually, as if the entire house had been designed to keep people at a distance, including the one who lived in it. Edward was 42, but he seemed to carry decades more on his shoulders. Black hair starting to grey at the temples, dark eyes that rarely met another person's, an erect and always controlled posture. He was the owner of one of the country's largest real estate development firms, responsible for building shopping malls, luxury condos, and corporate towers in major cities across the country. Financial success was never an issue, professional recognition even less so. Awards framed the walls of his office. Articles in trade magazines highlighted his entrepreneurial vision, and his name was spoken with respect in business circles. But inside his house, inside himself, Edward was just a broken man. 7 years ago, his life had changed irrevocably. His wife, Beatrice, was everything he didn't know he needed until he met her. They fell in love intensely, the kind of love that seems written in romantic screenplays. She was an architect, working at a small firm, and dreamed of transforming spaces into welcoming places. She used to say that a house needed to have a soul, that the walls should hold stories, not just divide rooms. Edward would often laugh at these daydreams, but deep down, he admired the way she saw the world. Beatrice made him feel human, vulnerable, capable of loving without measuring the consequences. When they found out she was expecting a baby, Edward felt a happiness he thought was impossible. They planned everything together: the nursery, the first walks, the dreams of a complete and happy family. But life has a cruel way of unraveling perfect plans. There were complications during childbirth. No one expected it. The doctors tried everything, but Beatrice didn't make it. In a matter of hours, Edward went from an emotional father-to-be to a desperate widower, holding a newborn daughter in his arms that he didn't even know how to care for. The pain was so sharp, so overwhelming, that he made a vow in that moment. He would never again allow anything to hurt him like that. He would never love again. He would never open up again. He would never let uncontrolled feelings take over his life. The baby girl was named Isabella Martin. She had her mother's eyes, almond-shaped and expressive, and her father's dark hair. Edward looked at her and felt an immense, devastating love, but he didn't know how to turn that feeling into gestures. He didn't know how to hug without feeling fear, how to smile without remembering what he'd lost, how to be present without shattering inside. So he did what he did best. He pulled away. He hired nannies, nurses, caregivers. He made sure the girl had the best of everything: expensive clothes, imported toys, renowned doctors, but time, presence, affection that he couldn't give. He returned to work with an almost obsessive dedication. He spent weeks traveling, closing deals, overseeing projects. When he was home, he locked himself in his office, answered emails late into the night, and avoided crossing paths with his daughter in the hallways. The nannies came and went. None lasted more than a few months. Some couldn't stand the coldness of the house. Others couldn't handle Isabella, who at 6 years old had already learned not to expect anything from anyone. The girl was quiet, withdrawn, almost invisible. She spent hours in her room, drawing in silence or looking out the window. She ate little, spoke even less, and didn't get attached to anyone. It was as if she had built walls around herself, unconsciously imitating her father's behavior. At the last nanny's dismissal, Edward didn't even attend the exit interview. He just signed the papers that Martha, his executive assistant, brought to him. Martha had worked with Edward for almost 15 years. She knew the company's inner workings, the strategies, the secrets, and also the personal tragedy he carried. She was a practical, direct, middle-aged woman with short hair and an attentive gaze. She didn't pity Edward, but she respected him. And more than that, she was worried about the child growing up surrounded by luxury and deprived of affection. It was Martha who knocked on his office door on that rainy July afternoon. Edward was reviewing blueprints for a new development in Atlanta when she walked in without knocking, as she often did. "Edward, we need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her. He didn't even look up from the documents. "If it's about the project in Chicago, I've already handled it. This isn't about any project. It's about Isabella." This time he stopped. His daughter's name always made him pause, even if just for a few seconds. He looked up and met Martha's firm gaze. "What happened?" "Nothing has happened yet, but it will if you keep ignoring the situation. The girl is sad, Edward, isolated. She barely talks, barely eats, barely interacts. This is the 5th nanny in 2 years. You need to do something." Edward sighed, rubbing his face with his hands. "I know, Martha. I know. But I don't know what to do. All the nannies I hired were qualified, had impeccable references." "Qualifications aren't the problem. The problem is you're hiring employees, not people. Isabella doesn't need another employee. She needs someone who will actually be present. And where am I supposed to find someone like that?" Martha crossed her arms, thoughtful. "Leave it to me. I'll find someone. But you have to promise me one thing." "What?" "That you'll give them a chance. A real chance. Without interfering, without judging too soon, without firing them at the first sign of trouble." Edward was silent for a few moments. He had an important trip scheduled in 3 weeks. He'd be gone for 2 months, visiting projects in Europe and closing deals with international investors. He couldn't leave Isabella alone, but he also couldn't stand the cycle of hiring and firing caregivers anymore. "Fine," he finally agreed. "Find someone. But I don't want interviews. I don't want to be involved. Just someone competent who will do the job." Martha nodded and left the office. Edward returned to his documents, but his mind was no longer there. He was thinking about his daughter, about those sad eyes he avoided meeting, about the silence that filled the house like a ghost. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, in Park Slope, Brooklyn, Helen Carter was in the small apartment she shared with her older sister. The place was modest but cozy, walls painted in warm tones, plants in the windows, photographs scattered around the living room. It was a world away from the houses where Helen had worked for the past few years. She was 34, of average height, with brown hair always tied back in a casual ponytail, and light eyes that held a mix of weariness and kindness. Helen had been a nurse for almost 10 years, working in public hospitals, crowded ICUs, and grueling shifts. She loved taking care of people, believed she was born for it. But 3 years ago something happened. A case that marked her deeply, a loss she couldn't process, a guilt that settled in even without rational justification. The details were too painful to revisit, but the result was clear. She couldn't go on. She quit, stepped away from the profession, and spent months trying to rebuild her life. Working as a nanny wasn't an obvious choice, but it made sense. It was a way to continue caring, to be present in someone's life, but without the brutal pressure of hospitals, without the life or death decisions, without the weight that had nearly destroyed her. In recent years, Helen had worked in a few homes, always with young children, always trying to offer more than the basics. It wasn't just about changing diapers or preparing meals. It was about being present, listening, understanding, being a safe harbor. Her sister Rachel walked into the living room holding her phone. "Helen, there's a call for you. Someone named Martha said it's urgent." Helen frowned and took the phone. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was firm, direct. "Helen Carter, my name is Martha. I got your contact information from a mutual friend. I'm looking for someone to care for a 6-year-old child, a full-time live-in position. Would it be possible to meet in person? Helen hesitated. A live-in position meant moving into the house, giving up her own routine, completely immersing herself in another family's life. She had done it before and knew how challenging it could be. Can you give me more details about the family? It's a widowed man, very successful, who travels a lot for work. The daughter is quiet, needs someone with patience and sensitivity. It's not an easy job, but I believe you're the right person for it. There was something in Martha's voice that conveyed sincerity. Helen agreed to meet her the next day at a coffee shop in Midtown. The meeting was brief but enlightening. Martha didn't hide the situation. She talked about Edward, about the tragedy that had destroyed the family, about Isabella and her difficulty connecting with people. She was also honest about the salary, which was generous, and the working conditions, which included room and board, and the freedom to organize the child's routine as she saw fit. He won't interfere, Martha assured her. In fact, he's barely home, but the girl needs someone, a real someone. Helen looked out the coffee shop window, watching people hurry down Fifth Avenue. She thought about Isabella, that child growing up in a cold house without human warmth, without laughter. She thought about herself, about her own need to find purpose again. "I'll take it," she said finally. 5 days later, Helen stood at the door of the house on the Upper East Side, holding a small suitcase and feeling the weight of what was about to begin. Martha greeted her and showed her to the staff quarters, which were on the ground floor near the kitchen. The space was simple but comfortable. A bed, a closet, a private bathroom. All very clean, very organized, very impersonal. Isabella is in her room on the second floor. Mr. Martin is in a meeting and won't be back until tonight. You can go up and introduce yourself whenever you're ready, Martha explained before leaving. Helen walked up the stairs slowly, observing every detail of the house. It was all so beautiful and so empty at the same time. There were no toys scattered in the living room, no drawings on the refrigerator, nothing to indicate that a child lived there. When she reached the second floor, she found the door to Isabella's room slightly ajar. The girl was sitting on the floor, surrounded by colored pencils, drawing in silence. Her dark hair was in 2 little braids. She wore a light pink dress, and she was barefoot. She didn't notice Helen's presence until she knocked lightly on the door. Isabella looked up. Her eyes were large, brown, and deep, eyes that seemed to carry too much sadness for a 6-year-old. "Hi," Helen said with a gentle smile. "My name is Helen. I've come to take care of you for a while." The girl didn't answer. She just stared, as if she were evaluating, measuring, deciding whether it was worth trusting or not. Helen didn't push. She didn't try to hug her, didn't try to start a conversation right away. She just sat on the floor a few feet away and looked at the drawings. "You're a very good artist," she commented. "Can I see?" Isabella hesitated, then pushed one of the drawings toward Helen. It was a house, large, full of windows, but empty. No people, no flower garden, no sun in the sky. Just a house. Helen looked at the drawing and felt her heart ache. She knew exactly what it meant. She knew what it was like to live in a place without life, without warmth, without a sense of belonging. "It's a beautiful house," Helen said, handing the paper back. "But I think it's waiting for someone to come and fill it with life. What do you think?" Isabella didn't answer, but for the first time her eyes shone differently, as if, maybe, just maybe, there was hope that something could change. And that's how it all began. Not with words, not with promises, but with a silent meeting between 2 people who, in different ways, needed to rebuild something they had lost. Helen spent the rest of the afternoon learning Isabella's routine. The girl had strict schedules for everything. She woke up at 7, had breakfast alone in the kitchen while watching cartoons on the living room TV, then played in her room until lunchtime. In the afternoon, more time alone, more silence, more loneliness disguised as independence. At night, she had dinner, took a bath, and went to bed early. All very mechanical, very predictable, very empty. The cook, Mrs. Peterson, a sturdy grey-haired woman who worked at the house 3 times a week, explained to Helen how things worked. Mr. Martin hardly ever has lunch at home, and he only has dinner when he doesn't have a commitment. The girl eats very little. She's very picky, but there's no use forcing her. They've tried everything. Helen listened attentively but didn't ask questions. She knew she would get to know the dynamic better over time by observing, living, and experiencing it. Every family had its codes, its silences, its wounds, and this family clearly had been bleeding for years. When it was time for dinner, Helen prepared something simple: pasta with homemade tomato sauce, which she made herself using ingredients she found in the impeccably organized pantry. She called Isabella to the kitchen, not to the formal dining room where the girl usually ate alone, supervised only by the television. Isabella came down the stairs slowly, suspiciously. She looked at the kitchen table where Helen had set 2 plates, 2 glasses of juice, and colourful napkins she'd found in a forgotten drawer. "We're having dinner here tonight," Helen announced simply. "I like kitchens, they're the heart of the home, don't you think?" Isabella didn't answer, but she sat in the chair Helen indicated. She started eating slowly, chewing in silence, always watching Helen with that analytical gaze that seemed too big for a child. Helen ate with her, telling silly stories about things she had seen on the street that day, commenting on the taste of the sauce, asking if Isabella liked to help in the kitchen. The answers came in the form of nods, small gestures, no words. But Helen didn't mind. She knew that trust isn't built in a day, isn't won with pressure. After dinner, Helen suggested that Isabella take a bath while she cleaned up the kitchen. The girl obeyed, went upstairs alone, and came back half an hour later in her pajamas, her damp hair falling over her shoulders. Helen was waiting for her in the living room with a hairbrush and a towel. "Come here. I'll dry your hair before you go to sleep. Otherwise you'll catch a cold," Helen said, pointing to the sofa. Isabella hesitated again, but eventually came closer. She sat on the floor between Helen's legs and let her gently dry her hair, running the brush slowly through it, detangling each strand with patience. It wasn't a functional gesture, it was a gesture of affection, of closeness, of humanity. And Isabella, who wasn't used to it, closed her eyes and, for the first time in a long time, relaxed. When Helen finished, Isabella turned and looked at her. Her eyes were different, less defensive, less distant. "Are you going to stay?" the girl asked, and it was the first full sentence she had said since Helen arrived. Helen felt a lump in her throat. "Yes," she answered sincerely. "I'm going to stay." Isabella nodded and went up to her room. Helen stayed there alone in the living room, holding the hairbrush and feeling the weight of the commitment she had just made. It wasn't just a job. It would never be just a job. It was an emotional responsibility, a silent pact not to abandon this child who had already been abandoned too much. The night grew cold in New York. Edward came home around 10, tired from meetings that seemed endless. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, his gaze empty from a day spent talking about numbers and strategies without thinking of anything else. The house was silent, as always. He tossed his briefcase on the living room sofa, went upstairs without making a sound, past Isabella's room and saw that the light was off. Good, she was asleep. That was all he needed to know. He continued to his own room at the end of the hall, a huge minimalist space with a king-size bed in the center and a balcony overlooking the illuminated garden. The walls were white, with no photographs, no memories. Edward had removed everything that reminded him of Beatrice years ago. He couldn't bear to look at the past without feeling the pain pierce his chest like a blade. He took a quick shower, put on a t-shirt and sweatpants, and sat on the bed with his laptop. He needed to review the contracts for the trip he was taking in 3 weeks. It would be a long stint in Europe. London, Paris, Barcelona, Berlin, meetings with investors, site visits, business dinners. All very important, all very necessary, all very convenient for not being at home. As he typed, Edward heard a sound from downstairs. Light footsteps, a door closing, water running in the kitchen. The new nanny. He didn't even know her name. Martha had handled everything, as always. She said she was trustworthy, experienced, that she would be different from the others. Edward didn't really believe it. He had heard similar promises before, but a part of him, a small, almost imperceptible part, hoped Martha was right. Because Edward knew, even without admitting it out loud, that Isabella was suffering, that the girl was growing up sad, isolated, without learning to smile, without knowing what it felt like to be loved. And the guilt for that, as much as he tried to push it to the back of his mind, was always there, heavy, suffocating. He closed the laptop, lay down, and turned off the light. He stared at the ceiling in the dark, listening to the silence of the house, thinking about everything and nothing at the same time. Within minutes, sleep came, restless as always, filled with fragmented images, whispers of a voice he no longer heard. Downstairs, Helen was still awake. She had finished organizing her things, put her clothes in the closet, and placed a few family photos on her nightstand. Her sister Rachel, her parents who lived upstate, smiling nieces and nephews. They were her anchors, her reminders that despite everything there was still love in the world. She sat on the bed, picked up her phone and sent a text to Rachel. Made it safely. The house is beautiful but empty. The girl is sweet but so sad. It's going to be a challenge, but I think I'm in the right place. The reply came quickly. You've always been good at this, sis, taking care of those who need it. It's all going to work out. Love you. Helen smiled, put her phone aside, and turned off the light. She lay down in the narrow bed, pulled up the comforter, and thought about the day. She thought about Isabella, about that silent plea for companionship, that fear of getting attached and being abandoned again. She thought about Edward, a man she hadn't even met yet, but whom she could already picture. A broken man, hidden behind invisible walls, unable to get close to his own daughter for fear of feeling. Helen knew that kind of pain. Not in the same way, not with the same story, but she knew it. She knew what it was like to be afraid to love, because loving meant losing. She knew what it was like to build walls to protect yourself, only to end up isolated in the process. And she also knew that walls could be torn down, with time, with patience, with true presence. She closed her eyes and, for the first time in weeks, slept peacefully, because she had a purpose again, because she had someone who needed her, and because deep down she needed this too. She needed to prove to herself that she was still capable of making a difference, that she could still care without falling apart. The first few days were about adjustment. Helen woke up early, prepared breakfast, and gently called Isabella. The girl would come down, still sleepy, sit at the kitchen table and eat in silence. But gradually small changes began to appear. Isabella started helping to set the table. She started choosing which juice she wanted. She started asking simple questions, like what time it was or if it was going to rain. Helen never forced conversation. She just shared her presence. Sometimes she told stories from her childhood. Other times she hummed while washing the dishes. Isabella would stay nearby, watching, absorbing, learning that it was possible to exist without tension, without fear, without loneliness. Edward remained absent. He left before Isabella woke up and came home after she was asleep. He crossed paths with Helen only twice, briefly, in the hallway. He greeted her with a nod, nothing more. She tried to introduce herself, but he was already on his way out, always in a hurry, always with something more important to do. Martha showed up at the house a few days later, bringing documents for Edward to sign. She took the opportunity to chat with Helen in the kitchen while Isabella played in the garden. "So how's it going?" Martha asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee Helen had just made. "Challenging but rewarding. She's an incredible girl. She just needs time to trust." Martha smiled, looking out the window at Isabella, who was chasing a butterfly. "And Edward? Have you two talked?" "Barely. He practically avoids me." "Don't take it personally. He avoids everyone. But that's going to change. It has to." Helen frowned. "Why?" "Because he's leaving in 2 weeks. He'll be gone for 2 months, and when he comes back, he's going to have to face what he left behind." 2 weeks. Helen repeated it in her mind. 2 weeks until Edward left, and she would be completely responsible for Isabella. 2 weeks to create a bond strong enough that the girl wouldn't feel abandoned again. She looked at Isabella outside, now sitting on the grass, examining a flower she had picked, and she decided she would do everything in her power to make sure that child knew, for the first time in her life, what it felt like to be truly cared for. In the days that followed, Helen subtly transformed the household routine, not abruptly or invasively, but with small gestures that made all the difference. She started preparing more varied breakfasts, cutting fruit into fun shapes on Isabella's plate, making heart-shaped pancakes, leaving colorful little notes next to her juice glass. "Good morning, Isa. Today is going to be a special day." Isabella read the notes in silence, but Helen noticed the faint smile that formed on the girl's lips. It was a shy, almost imperceptible smile, but it was there, and that was all that mattered. In the afternoons, Helen proposed different activities. One day they baked cookies together, getting the whole kitchen covered in flour, laughing when the dough stuck to their fingers, tasting the chocolate chips before putting them in the batter. Another day they built a fort in the living room using sheets and pillows, and they read stories inside with flashlights. Isabella participated cautiously at first, but gradually she began to open up, allowing herself to play, allowing herself to be a child. One afternoon, while they were watercolor painting in the garden, Isabella asked a question that took Helen by surprise. "Helen, do you have any kids?" Helen stopped painting for a moment and looked at the girl. "No, sweetie, I don't." "Why not?" Helen thought about her answer. She could have lied, could have changed the subject, but she decided to be honest within the limits a 6-year-old could understand. "Because I haven't found the right person to build a family with yet. But you know what? Taking care of you has been very special to me." Isabella was silent, processing the information. Then she went back to painting, but something in her posture had changed. She was more relaxed, closer, as if that honest answer had built a bridge of trust between them. That night, after Isabella was asleep, Helen was in the kitchen organizing the art supplies they had used when she heard footsteps coming down the stairs. She turned and saw Edward standing at the kitchen entrance, still in his work suit, tie loosened, looking tired. "Good evening," Helen greeted him, drying her hands on a dish towel. Edward nodded, went to the refrigerator, and took out a bottle of water. He stood there for a few seconds, as if deciding whether to say something or not. "Is Isabella asleep?" he asked, not looking directly at Helen. "Yes, she fell asleep about half an hour ago. It was a busy day, we did a lot of activities." Edward closed the water bottle and leaned against the counter. "What kind of activities?" Helen detected a hint of suspicion in his voice, as if he were testing her, checking, making sure she wasn't doing anything wrong. "We painted in the garden, baked cookies this morning, read stories in the afternoon. Simple things, but she seems to enjoy them." Edward was silent for a long moment. Then he finally looked at Helen. His eyes were dark, tired, and filled with something she couldn't quite decipher. Guilt, maybe, or fear. "Is she okay?" he asked, and there was a vulnerability in that question that made him seem less distant, less unapproachable. "She is," Helen answered sincerely. "She's an incredible girl, Mr. Martin. She just needs time and patience." Edward nodded, picked up his water bottle, and left the kitchen without another word. Helen stood there, listening to his footsteps go up the stairs, and felt that she had just witnessed something important. For the first time, Edward had shown genuine interest in his daughter. It wasn't much, but it was a start. In the following days, Edward started coming home a little earlier, not by much, just 15 or 20 minutes, but enough to still find Isabella awake. He didn't interact with her directly, but he would stand at her bedroom door watching as Helen helped the girl get ready for bed. Isabella noticed her father's presence a few times, but said nothing. She just glanced at him, as if she didn't know how to react. One night, 3 days before his trip, Edward walked into Isabella's room while Helen was reading her a story. The girl was lying in bed, hugging a teddy bear, her eyes getting heavy with sleep. Helen paused her reading when she saw Edward at the door. "You can continue," he said, walking in slowly and sitting in the armchair next to the bed. Helen kept reading, but she was aware of the tension in the air. Isabella's eyes were fixed on her father, as if she couldn't believe he was there. Edward, in turn, looked at his daughter with an expression Helen couldn't fully decipher. There was love there, she was sure of it, but there was also pain, fear, an invisible barrier that kept this man from getting close. When Helen finished the story, Isabella was almost asleep. Helen stood up, tucked the blanket around the girl, and gave her a soft kiss on the forehead. "Good night, Isa. Dream of beautiful things." She left the room, leaving Edward there. She stood in the hallway for a few moments, unsure if she should leave or wait. She decided to wait. A few minutes later, Edward came out of the room, closing the door carefully. They met in the hallway under the soft light of the modern chandeliers. Edward seemed different, less rigid, less distant, but still confused, still lost. "Thank you," he said, and that simple phrase carried much more meaning than it seemed. "You're welcome," Helen replied. Edward hesitated as if he wanted to say more but couldn't find the words. Finally, he just nodded and headed to his own room. Helen went downstairs, back to her room, and knew that something was changing in that house. Slowly, imperceptibly, but it was. And when Edward left for his trip, she would have the opportunity to deepen that transformation even more. To show Isabella that she was loved, important, and deserving of affection. And maybe, just maybe, when Edward returned, he would find not only a happier daughter but also the courage to be the father he always wanted to be but never knew how. Because some stories need to be rewritten, and this one clearly was one of them. JFK Airport was as busy as ever on a Monday morning. Edward moved quickly through the executive check-in, pulling his black carry-on, wearing an impeccable grey suit, and that serious expression people around him knew well. Martha accompanied him to the security entrance, double-checking his documents, important contacts, and hotel reservations one last time. "If there are any problems, you call me. It doesn't matter what time it is," she said, handing him a folder of organized papers. Edward nodded, distracted. His mind wasn't there, wasn't on business, wasn't on the contracts he would be signing in London in a few hours. It was at home. It was in Isabella's room, in that moment when he walked in and saw her lying in bed, listening to Helen read a story, with a peaceful expression he hadn't seen in years. The night before, Edward had tried to say goodbye to his daughter. He went into her room after dinner and found her drawing at the little pink table by the window. Isabella looked up when she saw him, but said nothing. She just sat there waiting, like someone waiting for a storm to pass. "Isabella, I'm leaving tomorrow," Edward began, not quite sure how to continue. "I'll be gone for a while, but Helen will be here with you. If you need anything, you can ask her, okay?" The girl nodded and went back to her drawing. Edward stood there, searching for words that wouldn't come. He wanted to say he would miss her, that he loved her, that he wished he could be different. But the words were stuck in his throat, too heavy to come out. So he just walked over, hesitantly, and kissed the top of her head. It was a quick, almost mechanical gesture, but it was the most he could manage. Isabella didn't react. She didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either. She just kept drawing, as if that moment meant nothing. Edward left the room with a heavy heart, went down to the kitchen, and found Helen organizing utensils after dinner. She saw him and smiled gently, in that way that made him feel both uncomfortable and welcomed at the same time. "She'll be fine," Helen said, as if she knew exactly what he was thinking. "We'll be fine." Edward didn't answer. He just nodded and went up to his room. He spent the whole night awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything and nothing. Now, at the airport, Martha was watching him closely. "Are you sure everything's okay? You seem worried." "I am," Edward admitted, and it was the first time in years he had acknowledged being worried about something other than work. "Worried about Isabella." Martha gave him a maternal smile. "She's in good hands, Edward. Helen is special. You'll see when you get back." Edward wasn't sure what he expected to find when he returned, but a part of him, a small, frightened part, hoped Martha was right. They said their goodbyes, and Edward went through security, headed to the gate, and sat in one of the cushioned chairs, waiting for his flight to be called, thinking about the daughter he was leaving behind. Meanwhile, at the house on the Upper East Side, Helen and Isabella were in the kitchen having breakfast. The atmosphere was different that morning, lighter, freer, as if Edward's absence had lifted an invisible weight from the air. "Your dad's probably on the plane by now," Helen commented, spreading jam on Isabella's toast. The girl said nothing, but Helen saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Sadness, perhaps, or relief, or both, mixed in a complicated way that not even Isabella herself could understand. "You know what I was thinking," Helen said, changing the subject. "How about we do something special today? We could plant flowers in the garden. Would you like that?" Isabella's eyes lit up. "Can I pick the flowers?" "Of course. We'll go to the nursery after breakfast and you can pick the ones you like best." And that's exactly what they did. After breakfast, Helen and Isabella took a cab to a plant nursery. It was a charming place, full of colors, scents, and life. Isabella ran between the flower beds, touching the petals, smelling the lavender, amazed by this universe she had never known. Helen watched her from a distance, smiling as she saw the girl so excited, so alive. It was a subtle but significant transformation. Isabella was starting to allow herself to feel, to allow herself to be happy. They chose sunflowers, daisies, jasmine, and some mint seedlings. They returned home with their hands dirty, carrying bags full of plants, laughing about silly things along the way. They spent the whole afternoon in the garden, digging small holes, carefully planting each seedling, watering them, and talking about things that were both simple and important. "Will the plants grow?" Isabella asked, looking at the sunflowers she had just planted. "They will, but it will take a little while. We have to take care of them every day, water them, remove the dead leaves, give them love. Then they'll grow strong and beautiful." Isabella grew thoughtful. "What if we forget to water them?" "Then they'll miss us. Plants need attention, just like people. If we don't take care of them, they wither." Isabella looked at Helen, and in her gaze there was a deep understanding, a silent connection. It was as if she knew, without fully understanding, that Helen was talking about much more than just plants. That night, Isabella asked to sleep with her windows open to hear the sounds of the garden. Helen agreed, helped the girl get into bed, covered her with a light sheet, and stayed there for a few minutes, just watching. Isabella was different, more peaceful, more secure, and that filled Helen's heart in a way she hadn't expected. When she left the room and went down to the kitchen, Helen picked up her phone and saw a text from Martha. "How are things over there?" Helen smiled and typed back, "We're good. Isabella is opening up more every day. We planted flowers today. It was beautiful to see her so excited." The reply came quickly. "Glad to hear it. Edward is in London now, said he'll call to talk to Isabella tomorrow." Helen put her phone away and felt a tightness in her chest. She didn't know how Isabella would react to a call from her father. She knew their relationship was complicated, full of silences and distance, but maybe this trip could be an opportunity for Edward to reflect, to realize what he was missing while hiding behind his work. The days that followed were filled with discoveries and learning. Helen and Isabella created their own routine, full of small rituals that made all the difference. They woke up early, had breakfast together on the patio, tended to the plants in the garden, did art projects in the afternoon, and at night they read stories until Isabella fell asleep. Helen also began to work on some emotional issues with Isabella. Subtly, through stories and games, she helped the girl understand and name her feelings. She used children's books that talked about loss, longing, love, and fear, and Isabella absorbed everything, asking questions, sharing thoughts, gradually learning that feeling wasn't dangerous. One afternoon, while they were painting together in the living room, Isabella asked something that took Helen by surprise. "Helen, was my mom pretty?" Helen paused, looking at the girl. It was the first time Isabella had mentioned her mother. Her heart raced, but she kept her voice calm. "I never met your mum, sweetie, but I'm sure she was very beautiful. Do you look like her?" Isabella shrugged. "I don't know. There are no pictures of her in the house." Helen felt her throat tighten. No pictures. Had Edward erased all memories of Beatrice from the house? That was more painful than she had imagined. "You know what I think," Helen said, choosing her words carefully. "I think your mum loved you very much, and I think she would be very proud of the beautiful, smart girl you're becoming." Isabella was silent for a long moment, processing those words. Then she went back to painting, but Helen noticed that something important had happened. A door had been opened, a wound had been touched, and now, with time and care, that wound could begin to heal. When Edward called for the first time 3 days after he left, Isabella was in the garden watering the plants. Helen answered the phone in the kitchen, recognizing his tense voice on the other end. "Hello, Helen. How are things?" "We're fine, Mr. Martin. Everything's calm here. Isabella is in the garden. Would you like to speak with her?" There was a pause. "Yes, please." Helen called Isabella, who came running barefoot, her hands dirty. Helen handed her the phone. "It's your dad." Isabella took the phone and put it to her ear. "Hello?" On the other end, Edward didn't know what to say. "Hi, sweetie. How are you?" "Good. I planted sunflowers. They're going to get big." "That's great. Are you enjoying your time with Helen?" "I am. We do lots of things together." Edward felt his heart ache. "That's good. I'll be back soon, okay?" "Okay. Bye, Dad." And she hung up, handed the phone back to Helen, and ran back to the garden. Edward stood on the other end of the line, listening to the silence, feeling distant not just geographically, but emotionally, feeling like he was losing something precious while he was away. Helen noticed the brevity of the conversation, but didn't comment. She knew that was the most Isabella could offer at the moment, and she also knew that Edward needed to understand that relationships aren't built over the phone, aren't built from a distance. They require presence, time, and true commitment. The weeks went by, and Isabella's transformation became more and more evident. She laughed more, talked more, played more freely. She started calling Helen Lena, an affectionate nickname that came about naturally, and Helen, in turn, felt more connected to the girl each day, more responsible for her emotional well-being. One afternoon, while they were baking cookies in the kitchen, Isabella asked a question that changed everything. "Lena, are you going to leave when my dad comes back?" Helen stopped mixing the dough and looked at Isabella. The girl's eyes were wide, worried, waiting for an answer that could destroy or rebuild everything they had built together. "Why would you think I'm going to leave?" "Because they all do. They stay for a while and then they leave." Helen felt her heart break. She knelt in front of Isabella, held her small, flour-dusted hands, and looked her right in the eyes. "Isa, I'm not leaving. Not as long as you need me. Not as long as I can be here, I promise." Isabella started to cry. They weren't tears of sadness, but of relief, of finally believing that someone would stay, that someone wouldn't abandon her. Helen hugged her tightly, let her cry, let all that accumulated pain come out of that little wounded heart. They stayed there, hugging in the middle of the kitchen, surrounded by flour and sugar, while outside the sun began to set over New York, painting the sky in shades of orange. That night, when Isabella was asleep, Helen sat on the living room sofa and thought about everything that had happened in the past few weeks. She thought about how important this girl had become to her, how taking care of Isabella was healing her own wounds. She thought about Edward, that man who ran from his own feelings, who hid behind his work to avoid facing his pain, and she thought for the first time about what would happen when he returned, about what it would be like to share this space again, to face his presence, which both bothered and intrigued her. Because something was changing inside her too, something she didn't want to name yet, but it was there, growing slowly, like the sunflowers they had planted in the garden. Meanwhile, in London, Edward was in his hotel room, looking out the window at the illuminated city. He had just finished a video conference with investors, closed an important deal, and met all the professional goals of his trip, but he felt no satisfaction, no sense of accomplishment. He just felt empty. He picked up his phone and opened the photo gallery. Martha had sent him some pictures of Isabella during the week. The girl in the garden, smiling as she watered the plants. The girl in the kitchen, covered in flour with a huge smile on her face. The girl drawing, focused, with that peaceful expression he had never seen before. And in every photo, Helen was nearby, always present, always attentive, always offering what Edward couldn't give. He felt something strange pierce his chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't envy. It was something more complex, more profound. It was the painful awareness that he was losing his daughter, not to Helen, but to his own inability to be present. And it was also something he didn't want to admit, a growing curiosity about this woman who had walked into his house and changed everything without asking for permission. Edward looked at the most recent photo. Isabella hugging Helen, both of them smiling, both happy. And for the first time in 7 years, Edward wanted to go home. Not out of obligation, not out of responsibility, but because there was something there he needed to understand, something he needed to face. There were still 5 weeks left until the end of his trip. 5 weeks that felt like an eternity, 5 weeks in which everything could change even more. And he didn't know if he was ready for it, but he knew he had no choice but to find out. The weeks continued to pass, each one bringing new discoveries and challenges. Helen noticed that Isabella had frequent nightmares. The girl would wake up in the middle of the night, scared, crying softly so as not to bother anyone. It was a restrained, learned cry, as if she had been taught from a young age that her feelings shouldn't take up space. The first time it happened, Helen woke up to the muffled sound coming from Isabella's room. She got up quickly, went upstairs, and found the girl curled up in bed, trembling, clutching her teddy bear to her chest. "Isa, what's wrong?" Helen asked, sitting on the edge of the bed and turning on the lamp. The girl couldn't answer, just threw herself into Helen's arms. Helen hugged her tightly, making gentle, circular motions on her back. "It was just a bad dream, my love. It's over now. I'm here with you." They stayed like that for several long minutes, until Isabella calmed down. Helen didn't judge her, didn't minimize her fear, didn't say it was silly. She just stayed there, offering the presence the girl so desperately needed. "Do you want me to stay here until you fall back asleep?" Helen offered. Isabella nodded. Helen lay down beside her in the small bed and began to sing a lullaby that her own mother used to sing to her. Her soft voice filled the room, chasing away the ghosts, bringing a sense of security. Isabella fell asleep a few minutes later, her breathing finally calm. Helen stayed there for another hour, just watching, making sure the girl was okay. When she finally returned to her room, it was past 3 in the morning. She lay down, exhausted but with a full heart, because she knew that had been a moment of deep connection, of true trust. In the following days, Helen began to carefully address the topic of nightmares. She used drawings, games, and subtle conversations to help Isabella process her fears. She discovered that the girl dreamed of figures disappearing, of doors closing, of empty places. It wasn't hard to understand the source of those nightmares. Isabella carried the fear of abandonment viscerally, in every cell, in every breath. "You know what helps when we're scared?" Helen said one afternoon as they were drawing together. "We talk about it. When we let the fear out, it gets smaller." Isabella looked at Helen, her large eyes attentive. "Are you scared of anything, Lena?" "I am. Sometimes I'm scared I'm not good enough, that I can't help the people I love, but you know what I do? I remember that I don't have to be perfect, I just have to be present." Isabella thought about that for a moment. "What if you leave?" Helen felt her chest tighten. "Isa, I've already told you, I'm not leaving, but I understand that it's hard to believe because people have left before, so I'm going to prove it to you every day that I'm staying, and one day you'll truly believe it." The girl said nothing, but Helen saw a tear roll down her cheek. It was a silent tear, heavy with years of repressed pain. Helen hugged her, and they stayed like that, held by a shared silence that said more than any words could. Meanwhile, Edward continued his frantic routine in Europe. London, Paris, Barcelona, Berlin. Meetings, contracts, business dinners. Everything was going according to plan, but something inside him was changing. The calls home, which were initially brief and formal, started to get longer. He called every day, always at a time when he knew Isabella would be awake. The conversations were still awkward, full of uncomfortable silences, but there was a genuine effort on Edward's part. He asked about the garden, the drawings, the stories. Helen read. And Isabella, little by little, began to open up a bit more. She shared details, small accomplishments, and let out shy laughs. Helen always stayed nearby during the calls, not to eavesdrop, but to support Isabella. And she noticed that, on some occasions, Edward wanted to talk to her too. He would ask Helen to take the phone after Isabella said goodbye, and then he would ask questions about the routine, about the girl's behavior, about things he had never asked before. Is she different? Edward asked one night, his voice sounding tired but curious. "She is," Helen replied. "More relaxed, more confident. She still has nightmares sometimes, but we're working on it." "Nightmares?" Edward repeated, and there was guilt in that word. "Yes, but it's normal, considering everything she's been through. With time and care, it will get better." There was a long pause. Then Edward said something that surprised Helen. "Thank you for taking care of her in a way I couldn't." Helen was speechless for a moment. It wasn't her intention to replace Edward, not her place to judge him, but that thank you, filled with vulnerability, showed that he was beginning to see his own absence. "Mr. Martin, it's not too late. When you come back, you'll still have time to rebuild this relationship. Isabella loves you. She just needs to know that you love her too." Edward didn't reply. He just thanked her again and hung up. On the other side of the Atlantic, sitting in his hotel room in Barcelona, he stared at his phone, thinking about Helen's words. It's not too late. Could it be true? Was there still a chance to fix what he had broken? He looked again at the photos Martha regularly sent. Isabella building sandcastles in a box Helen had set up in the garden. Isabella painting a giant picture on an easel Helen had bought. Isabella smiling, living, being a child. And in every image, Helen was there. Not as a shadow, not as an employee, but as someone who truly cared, who truly loved that girl as if she were her own. Edward felt something strange grow in his chest. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was a mix of gratitude, admiration, and something else he couldn't name. Helen was doing for Isabella what he should have been doing, and instead of resentment, he felt respect, and maybe, just maybe, something more. Back in New York, Helen and Isabella were creating memories that would last a lifetime. One day they had a treasure hunt throughout the house, with clues hidden in every room, ending with a cardboard chest full of chocolates and drawings. Another day, they put on an impromptu play in the living room, using sheets as curtains and acting out characters from stories Isabella loved. And on a rainy weekend, they had a marathon of kids' movies, eating homemade popcorn and laughing at the funny scenes. But it wasn't all fun. Helen also set boundaries, taught responsibilities, and expected organization. Isabella learned to put away her toys after playing, to help in the kitchen, to care for the plants they had planted together. And surprisingly, the girl didn't resist. On the contrary, she seemed to like having structure, knowing what was expected of her, understanding that rules weren't prisons, but forms of care. One afternoon, while they were watering the plants in the garden, Isabella made an observation that moved Helen. "Lena, look! The sunflower is growing." Helen came closer and saw that indeed the sunflowers they had planted weeks ago were starting to grow. Still small but alive, strong, reaching for the sun. "It is. And you know why? Because you took care of it every day. You watered it, pulled the weeds, gave it attention. Things grow when we care for them with love." Isabella looked at the sunflowers, then at Helen. "Like me?" Helen felt her eyes well up with tears. "Just like you, my love. You're also growing strong and beautiful because you're getting the care you always deserved." Isabella smiled, and it was such a genuine, free smile that Helen knew all the effort had been worth it. This girl was healing, slowly with ups and downs, but she was. That night, Helen was in her room organizing some clothes when she received a text from an unknown number. She opened it and saw it was from Edward. "Helen, I know it's late, but I need to ask something. Is Isabella happy?" Helen typed her response carefully. She's allowing herself to be happy. She still carries a lot of pain, but she's learning that it's safe to feel, safe to trust. She's rediscovering herself. The reply came quickly, "And that's because of you." Helen hesitated before replying. "It's because she needed someone to stay. And I stayed." There was a long pause before the next message. "Thank you for staying. I'll be back in 2 weeks. We need to talk." Helen put her phone away, her heart beating faster. "We need to talk." What did that mean? Was it about Isabella, about the future of her job? Or was it about something more? She lay in bed but couldn't sleep for a long time. She thought about Edward, This man she barely knew but who already occupied so much of her thoughts. She thought about what it would be like when he returned, what it would be like to share this space, this responsibility, this child she now loved as if she were her own. And she also thought about what she was feeling, because it was impossible to deny that something was there. A curiosity, a strange connection with someone she knew only through phone calls and brief conversations, but who, somehow, was as present in her life as if he were there every day. The last 2 weeks before Edward's return flew by. Helen and Isabella cherished every moment, created more memories and further strengthened the bond they had built. And when the day of Edward's return finally arrived, they were both nervous, each in her own way. Isabella was anxious, but also scared. She didn't know what it would be like to have her father back, didn't know if things would go back to the way they were. Helen, for her part, was apprehensive. She feared that Edward's presence would change everything, that the atmosphere would become cold and distant again. She feared losing the space she had carved out, the freedom she'd had to care for Isabella in the way she thought was right. But more than that, Helen dreaded seeing Edward in person, because something inside her had changed, and she didn't know if she was ready to face what that change meant. The night before his return, Helen put Isabella to bed and sat on the patio, looking at the illuminated garden. The sunflowers were taller now, firm, vibrant, a symbol that good things can grow when they receive care. And as she watched those flowers sway gently in the New York night breeze, Helen made a silent promise. No matter what happened, no matter how Edward reacted, she would continue to be a safe harbor for Isabella. Because that girl deserved to have someone who wouldn't give up on her, and Helen wouldn't give up. Ever. Because some stories need to be rewritten, and this one, clearly, was still just beginning. The flight landed at JFK around 7 in the morning. Edward quickly cleared customs and got into the car Martha had sent. During the entire ride, he was silent, a growing anxiety tightening in his chest. It wasn't the usual anxiety of returning. It was the awareness that he wasn't going back to the same house he had left. When the car stopped, Edward took a deep breath. It was almost 9 o'clock. He grabbed his bags and went inside. The house felt different. There were fresh flowers in the entryway, the smell of coffee coming from the kitchen, and laughter echoing from the garden. When was the last time this house had heard laughter? Edward dropped his bags and followed the sound. He crossed the living room and stopped. Isabella was running across the lawn, her hair flying in the wind, wearing a yellow dress, her feet bare. She was chasing soap bubbles that Helen was blowing, laughing, completely free, completely happy. And Helen was kneeling in the garden, blowing the bubbles, laughing along with her, with that gentle expression Edward had only imagined. She wore simple jeans and a white blouse, her hair messily tied up, no makeup. It was an image of simplicity that struck him deeply. It was Isabella who saw him first. The girl stopped, stood in the middle of the garden, looking at her father with surprise and something like joy. "Dad," she said, and it was the first time in years he had heard her say that word with real emotion. He opened the door and stepped into the garden. "Hi, sweetie." Isabella hesitated, but then she ran to him. Edward knelt, opened his arms, and for the first time he was able to truly hug her, without stiffness, without fear. He felt her small body against his, and something inside him broke. "I missed you," he whispered. Isabella pulled back a little. "Me too. Want to see what we planted?" She took his hand, pulling him toward the flower bed. Helen had stood up, watching the scene with a discreet smile. When Edward's eyes met hers, the world paused. He had imagined this meeting during his trip, but now standing before her, all the words escaped him. "Welcome back," Helen said. "Thank you. You can just call me Edward." Isabella, oblivious to the tension between the adults, kept talking about the plants, the sunflowers, the cookies they made, the stories Helen read. Edward listened, but his attention was divided. Part of him was there, genuinely interested, amazed by the transformation, but another part was hyper-aware of Helen's presence. After a few minutes, Isabella announced she was hungry. Helen smiled. "I'll make breakfast. Do you two want to eat together?" Edward was about to refuse, but Isabella was already pulling his hand. "Come on, Dad. We always have breakfast in the kitchen now." So Edward found himself sitting at the table, in a scene completely different from what he was used to. Isabella beside him, Helen making pancakes, eggs and fruit. The girl chatted about the books they'd read, the pictures she'd drawn. The breakfast was unlike anything Edward had ever experienced there. There was conversation, laughter, sharing. Isabella asked about his trip and Edward told her about the cities, the buildings, and for the first time he wasn't just filling silence. After breakfast, Isabella wanted to show him her drawings. She ran upstairs to get them, leaving Edward and Helen alone. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged with something neither of them could name. Edward cleared his throat. "I want to thank you for everything you've done for Isabella." Helen smiled, gathering the plates. "You don't have to thank me. Taking care of her has been a gift for me too. She's different, more alive. She was always alive. She just needed permission to be." Edward fell silent, processing those words. Permission to be. Had he denied his daughter that all these years? "You must be tired from your trip," Helen said. "If you want to rest, I can take care of Isabella." Edward was about to agree, but something stopped him. "No, I want to stay. I want to spend the day with her." Helen smiled. "Then today is going to be a special day." And it was. Edward spent the entire day with Isabella, something he hadn't done in years. They watched cartoons, played in the garden, and worked on a puzzle. Helen was always nearby but kept a respectful distance. Late in the afternoon, when Isabella was getting tired, Helen suggested she take a bath. The girl agreed, but before going upstairs, she hugged Helen first, a long hug, whispering something Edward couldn't hear. Then she came to him and hugged him too, more reservedly, still learning. When Isabella went upstairs, Edward stood in the living room looking out at the garden. "Can I ask you a question?" Edward said. "Of course." "How did you do it? In such a short time, how did you do what I couldn't in 7 years?" Helen came closer. "I didn't do anything extraordinary. I was just present. I listened without judging. I offered affection without asking for anything in return. Isabella just needed to know it was safe to open up." Edward turned to look at her. "And you knew that because I've hidden myself away too. I know what it's like to be afraid of feeling, and I know the only way to tear down those walls is with patience and true presence." There was a vulnerability in Helen's voice. Edward realized she wasn't just talking about Isabella. "What happened to you?" he asked softly. Helen hesitated. "I worked as a nurse for years. I loved taking care of people. But there was a loss that marked me deeply. I questioned everything. I couldn't continue." Edward saw the pain. "And now? Now I'm rebuilding. I discovered I can care in other ways. Taking care of Isabella has been part of that process." They stood in silence, sharing something beyond words. Edward felt a deep connection with this woman. "Thank you," he said. But this time it wasn't just for Isabella. It was for everything. Helen just smiled, a smile that held understanding and something more. "You're welcome." That night, after Isabella was asleep, Edward didn't go straight up to his room. He went down to the kitchen and found Helen making tea. "May I?" "Of course," Helen replied, pouring him a cup. They sat at the table and really talked, not about Isabella, but about life. Edward told her about Beatrice, about the pain of his loss, about how he had closed himself off. Helen told him about her family, her career, the weight of holding lives in her hands. They talked for hours, and when Edward went upstairs, it was past midnight. He lay down but couldn't sleep. His mind was filled with images from the day. In the following days, Edward didn't go back to work immediately. He spent a week with Isabella, learning how to be a father in a new way. Helen gradually gave him space, teaching him how to do things the way Isabella liked. But the more time they spent together, the more Edward realized he was feeling something for Helen, an attraction that wasn't just physical but emotional, a desire to know her better, to be near her. Helen was confused too. She hadn't expected to be attracted to Isabella's father. Edward was complicated, he carried wounds, but there was something about him that touched her. One night after Isabella was asleep, Edward found Helen on the patio. "Can I join you?" Helen nodded, and Edward sat beside her. They were silent for a few minutes. "Helen," Edward began hesitantly, "I need to tell you something." "Go on." "You've changed everything, not just for Isabella, but for me too. You showed me that there's still time to fix what I broke." Helen felt her throat tighten. "Edward, let me finish. I know you're here to take care of Isabella. I know I shouldn't mix things up, but I can't ignore what I'm feeling." Helen closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were filled with tears. "Edward, I feel something too. But I'm scared. Scared of messing everything up. Scared of hurting Isabella. I understand fear. I've spent the last 7 years being afraid. But being near you has made me realize that living in fear isn't really living." Edward leaned in and kissed Helen. It was a soft, hesitant kiss, filled with fear and desire. Helen responded for a moment, but then she pulled away, standing up quickly. "We can't. Not like this. Not now." "Why?" "Because you're still rediscovering yourself as a father. Because Isabella needs stability. Because I need to be sure that I'm not just an escape for you." "You're not an escape." "Then prove it. Prove that what you feel is real, that it's not just gratitude or loneliness." Helen went inside, leaving Edward alone. He stood there knowing she was right, but also knowing that what he felt was real, because some stories need to be rewritten. And this one was becoming more complicated, more intense, and more necessary with each passing day. The following days were strange. Helen maintained a polite but clear distance. She continued to care for Isabella with the same dedication, but avoided being alone with Edward. When he tried to start a conversation, she would respond cordially but briefly. When their eyes met, she would quickly look away. It was as if the kiss had never happened, as if their conversation on the patio had been erased. Edward respected her space, but frustration grew inside him. It wasn't anger, but a mix of confusion and helplessness. He had opened up in a way he hadn't in years, had admitted feelings he barely understood, and now he was facing a wall he didn't know how to cross. But at the same time, Helen's words echoed in his mind. "Prove that what you feel is real. Prove it to yourself first." And he knew she was right. He needed to understand what he truly felt, to be sure he wasn't using Helen as an escape, as a way to fill the void he carried. So Edward did something he had never done before. He sought help. He scheduled sessions with a therapist and began to talk about Beatrice, about the guilt he carried, about the 7 years of unprocessed grief. It was painful at first, reliving memories he had pushed to the back of his mind, but slowly it became liberating. The therapist, a woman in her 50s with a kind but direct gaze, helped Edward understand that he hadn't betrayed Beatrice by continuing to live. That loving again didn't mean forgetting who was gone, that he deserved a second chance at happiness, and that his daughter deserved to have a present and emotionally available father. Meanwhile, Edward continued to dedicate himself to Isabella. He went back to work, but differently. He cut back on travel, delegated more responsibilities, and prioritized being home. He had dinner with his daughter every night, helped with her homework, and participated in her daily activities. And Isabella blossomed with this attention. The girl laughed more, talked more, and sought out her father spontaneously. Helen watched all of this from a distance, unable to hide her satisfaction at seeing the transformation. It was exactly what she had hoped for when she took the job. To see a family rebuild itself, to see a child and a father learn to truly connect. But at the same time she felt a constant ache in her chest, because the more she saw Edward trying, changing, striving to be better, the harder it became to ignore what she felt for him. One afternoon, Martha came to the house to drop off some documents for Edward to sign. She took the opportunity to chat with Helen in the kitchen while they made coffee. "So how are things?" Martha asked, with that penetrating gaze that missed nothing. "Good. Isabella is great, and Edward is dedicating himself so much more to her." Martha smiled. "I've noticed. He's different, lighter, more present. And you, how are you?" Helen hesitated. I'm fine. Helen, I've known Edward for 15 years, and I've never seen him act the way he does when you're around. Whatever is happening between you two, it's real. Helen felt her cheeks flush. Nothing is happening. Not right now, but it could be. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, you know? Sometimes the best things in life happen when we least expect them. Martha patted Helen's shoulder and left the kitchen, leaving her alone with her thoughts. And Helen couldn't help but question if she was being fair. To Edward, to herself, even to Isabella. Because the truth was, she also felt something. Strong, something that went beyond professional. Something that both scared and attracted her. That night, Edward had an anxiety attack. He was in his office reviewing contracts when he suddenly felt his chest tighten, his breathing become difficult, his hands start to shake. It wasn't the first time it had happened, but this time it was more intense. He stood up, tried to take a deep breath, but couldn't. Helen was passing by the hallway when she heard a noise from the office. She knocked on the door and opened it slowly. Edward was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Edward!" Helen rushed to him, kneeling by his side. "What's happening?" He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Helen understood immediately. An anxiety attack. She had seen it countless times at the hospital. "Look at me," she said, holding his face in her hands. "Breathe with me. In through your nose, hold it out through your mouth. Come on with me." She began to breathe slowly, exaggerating the movements so he could follow. Edward tried to keep up, struggling at first, but gradually he got the hang of it. Helen didn't let go of his face, maintained eye contact, and kept her voice calm and steady. "You're safe. This will pass. I'm here with you." It took a few minutes, but finally Edward was able to breathe normally. The color returned to his face. His hands stopped shaking. He closed his eyes, leaned his head against the wall, exhausted. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "You don't need to apologize. This happens. You're going through a lot." Helen stayed there, sitting on the floor beside him, not with pity but with presence. After a few minutes of silence, Edward spoke. "I started therapy. I'm trying to process everything that's happened, to understand what I feel, to learn how to deal with my emotions without running from them." Helen looked at him surprised. "That's very brave. You inspired me. Seeing how you handle Isabella, how you're honest about your own struggles, made me realize that I need to stop pretending everything is okay too." They fell silent again, but now it was a comfortable, shared silence. Edward turned his head and looked at Helen. "I'm sorry about that kiss. I shouldn't have done it that way." "You don't need to apologize for the kiss. I just needed to understand what it meant. And I understand now. It's not an escape, Helen. It's not loneliness. It's real. But I know you need time to believe that, and I'll give you that time." Helen felt her eyes well up with tears. "Thank you." Edward reached for her hand and Helen took it. They stayed like that for a long moment, hands intertwined, sharing something that went beyond words. The weeks passed, and the dynamic in the house subtly changed. Edward and Helen weren't together, but there was a growing closeness, a silent complicity. They worked together in caring for Isabella, shared responsibilities, talked about their days, and laughed at little things. Isabella noticed the change and, in her childlike innocence, loved it. One night, as Helen was putting her to bed, the girl made a comment that caught Helen off guard. "Lena, do you like my dad?" Helen was speechless for a moment. "Why do you ask?" "Because he's happier when you're around, and so are you." Helen felt her heart ache. "Your dad is a good man, Isa. And yes, I like him, as a person, as your father. I wish you would stay forever, not as a nanny, as family." Those words hit Helen in a way she hadn't expected. As family. That's exactly what this house was becoming. It was no longer employer and employee. It was something much deeper, more complex, more frightening. "Let's see what the future holds, okay?" Helen said, kissing Isabella's forehead. "The important thing now is that you're happy and safe." "I am. For the first time, I am." That night, Helen had a difficult conversation with herself. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, she finally admitted the truth. She was in love with Edward, It wasn't a passing attraction, not professional admiration. It was love. Complicated, scary, but real. And she needed to decide what to do about it, because continuing to pretend she felt nothing was hurting everyone. It was preventing something beautiful from blooming, keeping them all stuck in an emotional limbo. The next day, Helen sought out Edward. It was a Saturday, and Isabella was at a playdate with a friend from school. Edward was in the garden, tending to the plants that had become his new therapy. "Edward, can we talk?" He turned, surprised. Of course. They sat on the garden bench among the sunflowers that were now tall and in full bloom. Helen took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "These last few months have been intense for all of us. When I came here, my only intention was to take care of Isabella. But things changed. I changed, and I've realized I can't keep pretending I don't feel what I feel." Edward looked at her, his heart racing. "What do you feel?" "I feel that I've fallen in love with you, and it scares me a lot. Because it wasn't the plan, because it's complicated, because it involves Isabella. But it's the truth. And I've learned that running from the truth only causes more pain." Edward closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process her words. When he opened them, they were filled with tears. "I've fallen in love with you too. And I know I still have a lot of work to do on myself. I know I'll still make mistakes. But I want to try. I want to build something real with you." "And Isabella?" "Isabella already loves you. She sees you as family. And I want you to be part of our family. Not as an employee, but as someone we choose to have in our lives, someone we love." Helen felt the tears stream down her face. "But what if it doesn't work out? What if I hurt you both? What if you realize you're still not ready?" Edward took her hands. "Then we'll deal with it together. I'm not promising perfection. I'm promising presence, effort, truth. I'm promising that I will try every single day to be the man you both deserve." Helen looked into his eyes and saw sincerity. She saw love. She saw fear, yes, but also courage. And she decided it was worth the risk, because some stories require courage to be rewritten. "Okay," she said, smiling through her tears. "Let's try." Edward pulled her into a hug, and they held each other for a long time, knowing this was just the beginning of something new, something scary, but also something beautiful. Because love, when it's real, is always worth it. Even when it's complicated. Even when it's scary. Even when it requires us to be braver than we thought possible. And on that sunny September afternoon, in the garden full of sunflowers they had planted together, Edward and Helen decided to give love a chance. Not a perfect love, but a real one, built on a foundation of truth, respect, and courage. But the path wouldn't be as simple as that moment made it seem. In the following weeks, Edward dove into therapy, working through deep-seated issues of guilt and grief. Some sessions were brutal, forcing him to face truths he had avoided for years. In one of them, his therapist asked a question that shattered him. "Edward, are you ready to love Helen for who she is, or are you using her to replace what you've lost?" The question echoed in his mind for days. He tried to convince himself he knew the answer, but the seed of doubt was planted. And the more he thought, the more confused he became. Helen noticed the change. Edward grew more distant, more lost in thought. She tried to give him space, but the uncertainty began to erode the peace they had built. One night, Edward had an intense nightmare about Beatrice, feeling an overwhelming guilt. He woke up in a sweat, went down to the kitchen and sat in the dark. Helen found him there. "What happened?" Edward couldn't look at her. "I don't know if I can do this, Helen." "Do what?" "Love you without feeling like I'm betraying Beatrice. Be with you without wondering if I'm using you to fill a void that will never be filled." Helen felt the floor drop out from under her. "Are you saying what you feel for me isn't real?" Edward looked at her, and there was so much suffering in his eyes. "I don't know. I'm confused, Helen. I'm afraid I'm hurting you, that I'm building something on a broken foundation." Helen felt the tears, but her voice came out firm. "Then I think it's best if I leave. What? No, Helen. Edward, I won't stay where I'm not sure I'm wanted. I won't be a doubt in anyone's life. I love you, but I love myself more. And I deserve someone who is sure of what they feel. What about Isabella? Isabella will understand, but I can't stay here while my heart is breaking. It's not fair to anyone. Helen went upstairs, grabbed a suitcase, and packed her things. Edward stood frozen, watching the woman he loved prepare to leave and unable to find the words to stop her. When Helen came down with the suitcase, it was 4 a.m. I'll leave my number with Martha. If Isabella needs me, you can call. But don't call for you. Only call when you're sure, when there are no more doubts. And then she left. When Isabella woke up and came downstairs, she found the house strangely silent. Where's Lena? Edward was in the kitchen. His voice cracked. She had to leave, sweetie. Isabella froze. Why? Because I messed everything up. The girl started to cry. No, Dad, you have to bring her back. Isabella was right. He had promised change, promised courage. And at the first real obstacle, he had chosen fear. The following days were the worst Edward had lived through since losing Beatrice. The house became silent, cold, and empty again. Isabella barely spoke to him. The plants in the garden began to wither. Life was dying again. One night, 2 weeks later, Edward was in Isabella's room trying to make peace. The girl was lying in bed, her back to him. Isabella, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but I need you to understand something. The girl didn't turn, but she stopped ignoring him. I spent 7 years afraid to love because I thought loving meant losing. When your mum was gone, a part of me died with her. But you know what I've discovered? That living in fear of loss is the same as not living at all. Isabella finally turned, her eyes red. Then why did you let Lena go? Because I'm a coward. Because I'm scared. Because I didn't think I deserved to be happy again. And now? Now I know I made the biggest mistake of my life. Helen wasn't a replacement. She was someone new, someone special, and I lost her because I wasn't brave enough. Isabella sat up, looking at her father with a maturity beyond her years. Then go get her, Dad. Stop being afraid and go get her. What if it's too late? Then at least you tried, at least you were brave. The next day, Edward went to Helen's apartment in Park Slope. Rachel, her sister, answered the door suspiciously. You're Edward? I am. I'm here to talk to Helen. Rachel hesitated but let him in. Helen was in her room. When she saw Edward, her face hardened. What are you doing here? I came to apologize. I came to say what I should have said that night. Edward, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to get hurt again. Then just listen. You don't have to answer. You don't have to forgive me. She remained silent. Helen, I spent 7 years hiding. I built walls so high I thought no one could ever get through them. But you did. Without forcing, without invading, just with your presence, your kindness, your courage. He took a step into the room. When I kissed you that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Fear, yes, but also life, and it terrified me so much that I ran. I convinced myself I was confused, but it was a lie. It was just fear. Helen felt the tears begin to fall. The truth is, I love you. Not because you take care of Isabella, not because you brought life into that house, but because you're you, brave, kind, real. You showed me that it's possible to rebuild, that it's possible to love without betraying the past. Edward knelt. I know I don't deserve another chance. I know. I hurt you. But I'm here with no masks, no defenses, asking you to consider giving me a second chance. I'm not promising perfection. I'm promising presence. I'm promising truth. I'm promising that I will choose you every day, even when the fear hits. Helen looked at him, seeing the vulnerability, the sincerity. And what if you change your mind again? It will come back. The fear will come back many times. But next time, I won't run. I'll talk to you. I'll fight it. Because I've learned that loving is choosing to stay even when it's hard. Helen was silent. Then finally she spoke. Edward, I love you too, but I need to know that you're ready, that you won't emotionally abandon me next time. I'm ready, and Isabella needs you too. She barely talks to me, she spends her days crying. Helen felt her heart ache. How is she? Devastated, just like me. Helen stood up, wiping her tears. I need to think, Edward. As much time as you need, but Helen, just one last thing. He came closer, holding her face. I choose you, today, tomorrow, always. I will keep choosing you until you believe it. And then he kissed her. It wasn't like the first kiss, impulsive and full of fear. It was a kiss of promise, of commitment, and Helen responded. When they parted, Helen smiled through her tears. Okay, let's try again. But this time, at the first sign of doubt, we talk. Deal? Deal. 2 hours later, Helen was back at the house. Isabella, who was in the garden, saw Helen and dropped everything. She ran, screaming, and threw herself into her arms. You came back. You came back. I came back, my love, and I'm not leaving again. Edward watched, his heart full of gratitude. He had almost lost everything to fear, but he had learned that love requires courage, it requires daily choices, it requires true presence. In the months that followed, Edward and Helen built something solid. It wasn't perfect. There were arguments, there were moments of fear, but they always talked, they always chose each other. Helen officially stopped being a nanny and became part of the family. There were no titles yet, no rush, but there was love, commitment, and a shared certainty. Isabella blossomed more each day. She had 2 adults who loved her, a house full of life, a garden full of flowers, and for the first time she had a real family. And Edward finally learned that loving again wasn't betraying those who were gone. It was honoring the life that continued. It was having the courage to be happy, to open up, to allow himself to feel. It was choosing to live, truly live, instead of just surviving. Because some stories need to be rewritten, and this one, after so much suffering, was finally being written with love, truth, and courage. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Edward, Helen, and Isabella has touched your hearts. If you were moved by this journey of rebuilding, of overcoming, and of a love that finds the courage to be reborn, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what resonated with you the most. Every day we bring you intense stories like this one, stories that reveal the deepest side of the human soul, that show it's never too late to start over, to love again, to choose life over fear. We'll see you in the next episode.